Hey, welcome to the AFI Movie Club. I'm Shawn Edwards. I'm your host for this week's celebration of cinema called Black Stories Matter. This is a partnership between AFI and Universal Pictures, and thanks to them, every movie this week is for free for rental. And today's movie is Loving, and we're talking to none other than Ruth Negga. Well, hold on, let me take that back. We're talking to Academy Award nominee Ruth Negga, who was nominated for the movie Loving. Congratulations on that. And it was a beautiful performance. No, I did
You bring them up and go. Make sure you.
No, actually, I did have to say that. And the reason why is because I remember seeing this movie for the very first time at the Toronto International Film Festival and was immediately not only blown away by the movie, but I was blown away by your performance. It's such an incredible, nuanced, layered performance. And that's why you're here today, because we want to discuss it. So I'm glad you have time to talk about this movie that stood the test of time. It's a very important movie, and it's a very relevant movie, especially considering everything that's going on right now in the world globally. So I guess the first question I would ask is, as a biracial woman yourself, how did you identify with Mildred Levy, the character you portrayed in the movie?
Well, I think just by nature of who I am, my father was Black and my mother is white. Even if I wanted to avoid it, it's unavoidable. Because I just felt that I couldn't quite believe that my existence would be such a problem for other people. It was. And I couldn't quite believe how recently, how troublesome my existence could have been. And that it was only in 1967 that it became legal for a Black person to marry a white person. That to me blew my mind. And of course that resonated with me. And this particular story did, because it was so extraordinary and so beautiful. And it was so, it was about two people who were sort of salt of the earth, blue collar, getting on with their lives. And they took on the might of the American judicial legal system, and they succeeded. And that to me was a story for not just this time, but all times.
Well, Mildred Levy, she unfortunately died in 2008, but fortunately there was like a treasure trove of photos and film footage on the couple. How did this help you while you were researching for this role?
Well, there was a contemporary documentary that was going to be made, but it wasn't realized. So there was all this footage from that time of them. And Nancy Bursky made it into a documentary called The Loving Story. And it was all this beautiful footage of this couple, not only fighting for the legitimacy of their coupledom, but also just them living their lives. And that struck me too. It was extraordinary just to see Mildred Loving just, disciplining her children, putting socks on their feet, playing games with her kids, talking to her sister, having sort of those little micro arguments with her husband, all those like human things, which really affected me. Because, people, we forget that there's not just the struggle, we have to live our lives as well. And people did, that was the other thing, people were just trying to live their lives and they have to have this struggle on top of it. And to me, this was extraordinary. And to play her, it was a blessing, because if you're talking just purely physically, I got to see her movements, the way she held her mouth when she spoke, or her accent, all those things. So they informed me and they were invaluable in that sense. But they also gave me a little insight into her spirit and who she was. And I tried to sort of inhabit that spirit.
It's a principle. It's a law. I don't think it's right. And if we do win, we will be helping a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And I know we have some enemies, but we have some friends too. So it really don't make a difference about my enemies.
For me, one of the most important things, probably the most important thing, was visiting her daughter, Peggy Loving, and getting her blessing. I wanted to reanimate her spirit so people would remember her, because no one I talked to had heard of them. And this was, to me, was extraordinary. You know, they invalidated the Racial Integrity Act. You know, I mean, they took on the Supreme Court and invalidated such a racist legislation. And I wanted to do her justice. And for Peggy to say, yes, I give you my blessing, was the grace I needed to just sort of try and inhabit this woman's spirit, which was really a joyful place to be. It was a lovely time in my life. I felt I felt her spirit of tenacity, courageousness, hope, and grit. I just felt that grit, you know, I really did. And that refusal to be anything else than what she was. The unashamedness of herself.
What's the one thing that you learned about Mildred that's just stuck with you?
That tenacity that I think she shares with a lot of civil rights activists, you know, that courage in the face of racist doggedness and violence, to me, is extraordinary. But that sort of doesn't do it justice, because it sort of negates the fact that there was great animosity towards people. And the threat of physical violence was very, very real. And there was a lawlessness to it. So, you know, I think that belief in yourself and your rights, your right to equality, and to be just considered to be a human being. When we think of it now, it just is so ridiculous. But is it though? You know, I mean, in the last few months, it really has called into question how far we actually have come, and how necessary her story is, and how reassuring her story is, how reassuring all those activists' stories are, that to not lose hope. And it can be, I understand the fatigue and the melancholy sometimes when you think, gosh, that mountain that we're climbing, but we're standing on the shoulders of these giants, and that gives me succor.
We're moving back to the country. I don't care what they do to us. I won't raise my family here.
How aware were you of American history prior to your involvement of the movie in terms of the civil rights movement? How much did you know about the civil rights movement? How much did you know about the 50s and the 60s and the lead up to where your character exists in time?
I've always had an interest in American culture and history. I grew up in Ireland and England, and I grew up in a very white space. And very early on, I realized that I would have to seek out the Black elements of my life for myself. and I took an interest in Black literature. Toni Morrison, Dr. Angelou, Baldwin, films, Spike Lee, Daughter of the Dust. I remember seeing that for the first time, being blown away, extraordinary, poetic. And so that led me on a sort of journey to learn about Black American history. And even though I'm not American, African American, I'm African Irish, it still is part of my history because I live here, but also it's part of the world's history. And I took a huge interest in it, and so I was aware of the Loving case. Also, like to me, like Black cultural history has been very important to me. You know, I mean, you know, when I remember seeing the James Van Der Zee photos of the Harlem Renaissance, no matter how staged they were, because I understand that they were just seemed to me so handsome and elegant and captured the zeitgeist of Black culture, and it filled me with such a confidence, and I recognized something, and it gave me a touchstone.
Well, I love your portrayal of Mildred Levy in the film, and the thing that I really loved most was that there isn't a lot of dialogue, and the dialogue that is there was so beautifully efficient in the script. What was your initial reaction when you read for the first time, when you read the script for the first time?
Well, I always joke, because I'm Irish, I like words. I can never give you a succinct answer, as you've probably garnered. But you know what? So much is excess and unnecessary. And Jeff Nichols' script was so lean and beautiful. And what I loved was the challenge of filling in the gaps. And it wasn't, to say it wasn't that hard is an underestimation of the project. But when you have a script that's good and that's that tight and that focused, and a couple who are like this, I suppose you just surrender.
What sort of conversations did you have with Jeff Nichols, who directed and wrote the screenplay for Loving? Did you guys have discussions on execution? Did you have discussions on tone? And what were some of the conversations the two of you had while on set?
I think Jeff prepares so well. It was one of those extraordinary projects where so much is unsaid. And there's just this sort of, I used to call it Radio Jeff, when we just tune and go, yeah, I know what you mean. I got it, yeah, we'll see it. Will we see how it goes? Yeah, great. And there wasn't that much discussion. And I think it's because that footage of Mildred and Richard is extraordinary. And it just lived in those spaces. And so whenever there was any doubt, we would just like go there, whether physically watching it or just spiritually or whatever. I felt their presence so keenly. I just felt like we were on a ship that had been invisibly guided by them. I don't quite cognitively understand it myself, but her presence and Richard's saturated the making of this film in a way that I don't understand, but I'm forever grateful for.
I was particularly struck with this scene in which you go to jail. And I just can't imagine that situation under any circumstance. And I was just wondering from you, where did you go mentally to pull that scene off? Because it's one of the extraordinary scenes in the film that just really builds that dramatic tension without being over dramatic.
It was actually very hard for me to watch because, first of all, physically we went to the jail cell that she was held in. We didn't film in it because it was too small. I just thought of her heavily pregnant when I was there, I just felt of all those, especially young men and women during the civil rights movement who lifted off the street and just pushed behind bars for no reason. And that fear, when are you going to get? Why are we in here? What will they do to us? And I think that was it. It was the fear of what will happen? Where are my rights? Who knows I'm here? And listen, that's not over. It's happening. Not just, it's happening all around the world. I don't think it really takes a whole lot of an imagination to experience that. It just happens to me, be my job to convey it as best I can.
Well, you were incredible in that scene. Job well done. Now we have a question from a screenwriter fellow. Her name is Kerry Bratton Lewis, and she's in Brattleboro, Vermont. Kerry.
Hello, Kerry.
Hi, Ruth. Thank you so much for being with us. So, you know, I've been listening and hearing you say a lot about the homework that you do, and you've done obviously an extensive amount of work on American culture, Black American culture, when you were preparing for this role. I'm curious to know what elements of your Irish culture you kind of intentionally or unintentionally bring in to every role that you do, and specifically with Mildred, if there's a certain training or a certain something, touchstone, totem that you bring with you.
That's interesting, my Irish culture. Well, there's another 400 years of oppression. It's different, you know, I mean, I think, wow, I mean, there's a whole heap of books, I think, written or should be written about the Irish leaving Ireland during the famine in the 1840s to go to America, and how they were treated and how they felt allied with slaves, but also how a lot of them became overseers, and how the Irish, being white, can assimilate. So that's that's a whole hours to get into. But in terms of my history, I think understanding what it's like to be another outsider. I mean, I come from, first of all, 2 famine countries, Ethiopia and Ireland, but also to be Black and Irish. You know, I mean, there's infamous signs and windows in England in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. No Blacks, no Irish, no dogs, you know. I cover 2 of those. So, you know, I think there is a common cause there. And Frederick Douglass, when he did his tour of Europe, he spent some time in Ireland speaking, and he found a common cause there. And I think that's an interesting thing to explore. And that's I didn't think consciously of that, but it is always there, informing. One's history always informs, whether you like it or not.
Ruth, you've been amazing. I love talking to you about the film Loving, one of my all-time favorite films. I could just watch it again and again.
Mine too, even though I'm in it.
But I do want to find out, we sort of understand the importance of the Loving story, but I want to find out from you, why do Black stories matter overall?
Gosh, this question, it could be answered in a sentence or in a thesis, you know?
Sure.
But it's important. So Toni Morrison said that in an essay, she said, art is an ancient need, you know? Look, she said, we hunger to articulate who we are and what it means. And we've been telling stories since we can, you know, since we can write them on walls, or since we can articulate them. And that's a universal truth, you know, wherever you go in the world. And yet, I feel that the telling has only been afforded to a few. Black stories in the West, as we know, have been marginalized, maligned, bastardized, generally untold. And, you know, we self-actualize through art. We get to have a clear understanding or an understanding, a grasp of who we are, who we might be, through telling stories, by bearing witness and witnessing ourselves. Toni Morrison said, she said, my memory is as necessary to yours as your memory is to mine. And I've always sort of substituted stories for that. My story is as necessary to yours as yours is to mine, you know. So don't disallow my story, because it's the only way we can move forward. It's the only way we can progress. Storytelling is a salve for our existence. It helps us to understand why. It doesn't have the answer, but it helps us to understand. And it can bring peace, you know. It can bring peace and understanding. And if you negate that and you ignore it, then you sort of abandon civilization, you abandon progress, and you certainly abandon history, and you smother it. And when you do that, danger. And there's no room for hope. And I think that's what's happening now, is that, you know, people might see it as sort of burning down the house. I don't. I think I see it as making room for the change that we need.
So well said. Well, Ruth, we really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us here at the AFI Movie Club to talk about your film Loving and your wonderful performance that hopefully people will get a chance to watch or revisit. And you can do so by going to AFI.com. Remember, this week's celebration of cinema is called Black Stories Matter. This is a partnership between AFI and Universal Pictures, and thanks to them, every movie this week is free for rental. Just go to AFI.com where you can watch Ruth Negga in Loving. Thanks so much, Ruth. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you.